Lovely.
Okay, we're preparing to go live on YouTube now. And we're broadcasting now, Anna.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Die to Let, the Health Impacts of Renting Whilst Ageing. My name is Donna Buxton and I'm the Head of Research here at ILC. Before we begin and I hand over to the chair for today, I just wanted to say a big thank you to the Centre for Ageing Better, Dr. Anna Dixon, who will be our chair today, and to all our partners across our Partners Programme. So just to tell you a little bit about our Partners Programme before we kick off. So as you can see here, ILC is a specialist think tank on the impact of longevity, and we seek to understand and plan for the future. We help government, individuals and industry to understand the issues that affect people today and tomorrow. And we just put here some priorities in terms of coronavirus and what we're currently working on in terms of research. And some of these issues I'm sure will come up today. So these are some of our current partners you can see here. And none of our webinars could be, or any of our events or work could be possible without our Partners Programme. And just to tell you a little bit about our partners. So if you wish to join our partnership programme, there are several benefits to joining. We can provide business intelligence, so we'll give you advance notice of our latest research and ad hoc briefings on areas of specific interest to your organisation. We can build networks and connections for you. So our partners events have included visits to Number 10, briefings with prominent influencers, as well as the opportunity to meet ministers and policy experts and fellow partners. There are also brand benefits to being a partner. So your brand will be visible through numerous events, press releases and presentations that we provide. And we'll give you the opportunity to be positioned at the heart of the debate on longevity. So without further ado, so that's a little bit about our Partners Programme and ILC. Without further ado, I'd just like to hand over to our chair today, Dr. Anna Dixon from the Centre for Ageing Better. Thank you, Anna, over to you.
Hello, and thank you, Donna. It's great to be here this afternoon. We're set for a really good panel discussion on the theme of Die to Let, particularly looking at the health impacts of renting for older people and while people are ageing. So I'm very pleased as the Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better to be co-hosting. We're also a partner of ILC UK. Before we get started, as ever, I'm sure getting very familiar with these webinars, just a few housekeeping matters. So if there are any internet issues that any of us have in terms of sound or video, please bear with us. We have help behind the scenes to fix things quickly and get us back up and running. Do feel free to use the chat function to sort of just make comments and respond to the conversation. But if you'd like to ask a question, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A after we've heard from each of our panelists, then please use the Q&A function, and I'll be keeping an eye on that later and drawing in questions from you. We're also going to be having a couple of polls, and so chance to get your views and to interact with us. So watch out for those. And please do, if you have any sort of other technical issues that you're experiencing, then again, use the chat function and someone from ILC UK will be monitoring that. If you like to be active on Twitter, you can see there the hashtag Die to Let. So if you are on YouTube or you prefer to be making your comments on Twitter, then please do that. We're also going to be recording it and it will go on the YouTube channel afterwards. So if you want to share it with colleagues or others that you think would be interested. So obviously a very topical debate. I think we've seen how important our homes are during the lockdown and the impact in terms of inequalities of people who are living in poor quality housing and poor conditions. So obviously we think of generation rent as being younger people. And so I think it's really good to be thinking today about the growing number of older private renters and also how we can start to look to the future when we know that there will be cohorts of private renters, people entering later life. I think we're also going to be touching, I'm sure, on some of the poor condition of the private rented sector. It's disproportionately doesn't have what we call thermal comfort, and often is not accessible. So I think there are issues that we might touch on in our conversations today about what more could be done to improve the condition and accessibility of the private rented sector. Obviously, there's a role there for local authorities. There are some legislative powers, but also we've got a landlord perspective today. And I think really important to look at how landlords can help their tenants, particularly those who are approaching later life. We might also look at some of the shifts between tenure from social housing to the private rented sector, and what that's going to mean longer term for the future of people in terms of their housing situation. And maybe look at whether there needs to be a bit of rebalancing back towards social housing, and indeed whether we need to make it easier for private renters to switch sectors. And I hope we will touch on the sort of new developments as we see more build to rent, and how we might think of and reconceive the offer to private renters, and whether there are some different options that we could be giving to the future generation rent. Some of these are themes I actually touch on, and I think I am allowed to give a short plug for my new book, The Age of Aging Better, and try and consider in there the different mix of tenures that we're going to need as we look to the future, and how we do build better homes across all tenures for people as they age. So that's just a little bit of context. As I say, I'm sure each of our panelists will enable us to go into a bit more depth on these issues, and hopefully we can get to them as well in the discussion. So I think without further ado, we're going to go to our first poll. So this is a chance to hear from you. So the question that we would like you to respond to is, what could be the drivers for change for the private rented sector post-COVID? The condition of homes and health outcomes, accessibility and adaptability of homes, or 3, affordability and tenure insecurity. So if you'd like to choose one of these options. It's quite a lot to read there, so please take your time. Okay, if everybody's had a chance to pick one, perhaps we can go to the results. So interesting. So we think that affordability and tenure insecurity are probably going to be the biggest driver of change, with over half of you thinking that that's likely to, particularly post-COVID, with obviously widespread job losses, economic downturn, and a risk that people won't be able to pay their rents. But actually, similar numbers, about a quarter thinking that, you know, issues around the poor quality of housing and the impact that's having on people's health, as well as the sort of lack of suitability in terms of access and adaptability. So I'm sure we will pick up these issues as I now introduce the first of our panelists, which is Lord Richard Best. I'm sure known to many of you. He is co-chair currently of the APPG on housing and care for older people, and in that capacity has produced a number of very important and seminal reports. So Richard, over to you.
Am I unmuted? Great, we're off. Thank you. Yes, lots of seminal reports. Thank you for that. From the APPG on housing and care for older people. This is the one I'm going to be talking about, if anyone would like to see it. There it is. Rental housing for an aging population, in our series of happy reports, housing our aging population reports. And this is, you know, your poll shows actually you've got a very knowledgeable audience out there. because this looks at the private rented sector, and it looks at the fact that at the moment there are about 450,000 people of pension age and over who are living in the private rented sector. That number will grow because generation rent is getting older, and those who are now 39, 42, whatever, they're almost certainly not going to become homeowners now. They've gone past that point when they're going to take out a 25, 30-year mortgage, and they are going to continue renting until they retire. And this has a number of problems for the future. We think that the number will rise from the current 450,000 private renting pensioners to, in the private rented sector, something like 1.5 million, another bit more than 1 million more people in the private rented sector. And this has some serious consequences if we just let this roll and just let this happen.
Richard, can I just pause you there, because we're getting a little bit of feedback on the chat that the audience are not catching all of your remarks, and I would be really sorry if people were not able to hear you properly. So I don't know whether it's your connection. You seem to have disappeared in video, but that might be a good idea to have your video off to improve the connection, and perhaps again just speaking a little closer to your microphone, and let's see if that helps.
Yeah, okay. Well, here I am closer to the mic. Does it sound a little better? Hopefully a little better.
It sounds a little better to me, but let's see how it goes for people.
Okay. Well, I was saying that the private rented sector, because generation rent is getting older, not good. Not good. Shaking of head from Anna. Do you want me to?
So what I might just suggest is that I might just go to Sue next, and then let's see if we can get your connection a little bit better in the meantime.
I could come in on the phone, possibly, if your assistant there would help.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We'll let them see if they can support you in the background to get a little bit of better sound quality. If you're happy to go back on mute, and I'll bring our second panelist in, and we'll come back to you, Richard. So our second panelist is Sue Adams, who is Chief Executive of Care and Repair England, a national charity which does amazing work to improve the housing and living conditions of older and disabled people. So welcome, Sue.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and hopefully you can hear me as well as see me. Yeah, we've got a thumbs up there. Thank you. I just want to reflect in particular on the condition of the housing stock in the context of ageing, and also a little bit of reference to the current COVID-19 implications. So just to start with saying that it's absolutely unequivocal. We have evidence that an accessible, a safe, a warm, and on a day like today, a cool home is good for your health. It has a huge impact on your health and well-being. And clearly in the context of a pandemic, the health of our nation is centre stage. And I think what it's also done is put the quality of our homes absolutely centre stage during lockdown. Irrespective of tenure, there are measurable impacts of the quality of characteristics of the home on our physical health. There are also enormous impacts on our mental health, again, as we've seen brought into sharp focus over the previous months. The quality of our housing stock, and I speak here from a knowledge of England and our data from England, so apologies anyone who's listening outside of England. We have 4.3 million non-decent homes, and just under half of those are older people. And I'm going to expand on the tenure of those homes and that distribution shortly. But I think we just have to remind ourselves there's a huge cost to the NHS. A very conservative estimate is 1.4 billion per annum. Now, where are those non-decent homes? Are they all in the private rented? Because people will tend to, by default, use percentages. So to use a percentage, 78% of the non-decent homes are in the owner-occupied sector. This is the 2 million older households. 11% are social tenants, 11% private rented. But proportionately, that private rented sector has some of the worst housing. Ironically, it has some of the best as well. And even though the private rented sector has been growing, the proportion of decent homes in the private rented has grown as new homes have come on stream. But also you've got a very high proportion of very, very poor housing, which fails the decent home standard on every single criteria. And I think what that reflects is how diverse the PRS is. So we know this from the RUG review and other studies. You've got quite a polarized sector. So you've got your very high end and the growth of the luxury end, the build to rent. And then you've got the absolute bottom of the pile in terms of housing quality. And so that diversity is something that you always have to keep in mind when we're talking about changes to housing tenure and an aging population. Now, I'm from a charity that's focused on disadvantage and inequality. And so what really concerns us is that low income tenants are pushed to the bottom of that market through a lack of resources, and they disproportionately suffer the worst housing conditions. So numerically, the greatest number of people in poor homes are older homeowners amongst our older population, but disproportionately some of the worst housing and people with the worst health are those at the bottom. They're overcrowded, very often they're shared facilities, cold, disrepair, infestation. And we've got a major challenge around, we'll come to the law later on, but we have got a major challenge of capacity to tackle that. Now, in terms of renting in old age, and there's a very useful summary of international evidence just being published by Cachet. And across the board, the renting in older age tends to reflect a lifetime of precarious employment and perhaps low income. And then alongside that is where people have experienced a dramatic life change. The really big trigger there would be early onset of disability and poor health. So people on insecure jobs suddenly have very little income. And a massive factor is divorce. You could have people who are in fairly secure accommodation, be that social rented, owner occupied, they divorce, and one of the parties is then finds themselves in insecure private rented, and that has huge impacts for health. Now, to move on very swiftly, because this is a summary, find my last note, the implications of this growth in low-income home ownership, low-income tenure amongst the owner-occupied sector has health implications, but the growth in the long term of more older people aging in the private rented sector has a both health implication and a fiscal implication. I think the health implication, the mental health side, which has really been brought home to us recently, is the insecurity of the large proportion of that tenure. Gives people a lot of control over their living situation, a constant worry about when their tenure is going to end. There's a disincentive to tackle and use the legislation that exists to try to make their homes better because of tenure insecurity. And the data shows us that the age group most concerned about tenure insecurity is the older age group. And they're the age group who have the greatest aspiration to move to secure social housing. Layered on top of that, which I haven't got time to talk about, but you've got issues around the adaptability of that stock, whether it's even worth spending money adapting it on short-term tenancies, the issues around access to information and advice and assistance to utilise what already is there. And my very last point in my 6 minutes is the fiscal implications of a population moving increasingly into private rented sector, which is the most expensive when it comes to housing costs. It's more expensive, particularly if you look at the expenditure on housing for this age group. It is considerably more expensive than those who purchase a home whilst we have low interest rates. People are not acquiring an asset, and we've built a social care system largely reliant on a use of assets. Half the people in social care are using their home and their assets to pay for that. And then the housing benefit implication of people entering retirement on a pension, which is not going to meet the costs of rent, It's 8 years since Strategic Society costed this, but you were looking at £80 billion per annum extra housing benefit cost. And so implications for individuals and the state of this shift, unless we rethink what are we driving forward, what's suitable for housing for later life, and what's suitable housing across the life course. And I just should say that there is clearly a role from all the research for the PRS, but the sector that seemed happiest with it, not so worried about tenure insecurity, are students and young people who are moving physically and are changing jobs, changing where they live. And so there's a clear sector where it works very well as it stands. But as it stands, it doesn't suit an ageing population terribly well.
Okay, Sue, thank you so much. Very rich set of remarks, and I'm sure and hope that we'll come back to some of that to unpack it a bit more in discussion. But really some quite sort of stark issues there that private rental tenants are facing around affordability, insecurity and poor quality. So perhaps painted a fairly negative picture. We know that there are some legal powers and there have been some improvements to the quality of private rental, and obviously it's very dependent on the landlords. So I'm pleased that we've got a landlord perspective on the panel today, and I'll introduce John Stewart, who is Deputy Director of Policy and Research at the National Residential Landlords Association. I understand it's a new representative body created by a merger of the NLA and the RLA. So great to hear more from you, John, about the work you're doing with your members.
That's good. Thank you very much, Anna. Actually, I think at the level of commonality across the panel was shown. Sue has reeled off a lot of the statistics and things that I was going to be relying on. So at least we know we're all using the same sources and the data can be relied on. But I will start with that issue about condition in the private rented sector, because you know, there is a good story to tell in some ways, and that, you know, the proportion of non-decent stock has fallen quite substantially over the last 10 years. And likewise, when it comes to energy efficiency, we've moved from well over 40% of the stock being rated F and G to just around about 6% of the stock being rated F or G. Clearly, with the decarbonisation agenda coming at us, and perhaps a reinvigorating of that because of COVID, F and G isn't good enough, or E isn't good enough. There's going to be a move to targets, and that is challenging for the sector. One thing we didn't touch on was the age of the stock within the private rented sector. It does tend to be older stock, more difficult to treat and bring up to standard, more difficult to change and adapt. But you know, I think perhaps the sector gets very little credit for the improvements it's made, because the focus is very much on where improvement still needs to be made. And you know, we want to see healthy homes within the sector. You know, a lot of the issues around about an aging population result from age itself. You know, as the Scots would say, old age doesn't come itself. But we don't want to see housing that makes that worse for people. Housing should not be making people more ill. It should not be making people's lives more difficult if possible. And I think we also touched on an issue there from Sue. I think poverty is actually a key issue here as well. You know, generally speaking, the older generation has been protected over the last 10 years from the cuts that have affected the bulk of the public sector and the rest of society, but not to such an extent that those at the bottom end, the most in need, have been protected. So by and large, older people have seen their share of wealth and the like grow relative to the rest of society, but there is a group of people within there that haven't benefited, in fact have relatively gone backwards. So I think we can't just address this in terms of age itself. I think poverty is a key issue when looking at the private rented sector. And if we're looking at affordability, there's two sides to affordability. And I think we see a lot of attention put on the cost side of things, rent levels, and perhaps less attention paid to the income side of things. And it's an area where we at the NRLA are able to make common cause with perhaps some people that we would not often get into bed with, as it were. Crisis and shelter and the tenant groups. I think we're all supportive of a raise in the the local housing allowances to better meet market rents. And I think when it comes to an ageing population, that is a huge issue. There's a question of whether that whole bulge of middle-aged renters that will all find their way through to private renting in their older age. There's a question of when inheritance is coming through to people, whether that will be a route for some people out of private renting and into home ownership, either through being able to pay for a deposit themselves or inheriting a home for a relative. But there is no doubt we're going to see substantial growth in the number of older renters in the private rented sector. That comes with a number of challenges around about quality of stock and adaptability. I also think security is an issue, and and this is where I'm maybe going to be a little bit controversial. By and large, landlords are not looking to evict people. The so-called no-fault eviction process, Section 21, generally there's another underlying reason for a landlord serving that. Notice me, antisocial behaviour, usually arrears. So getting rid of Section 21 is not going to stop evictions from the sector. It's just simply going to shift it from the no-fault basis to a grounds-based basis, because the grounds are there. And I don't think it helps with talking constantly about insecurity in the private rented sector, because tenancies are lasting longer. Landlords want good tenants who look after the property and pay the rent on time and regularly, and that is quite often typically older renters. So I think that, you know, by constantly talking about the fact that someone could be evicted at the drop of a hat at the whim of the landlord, I think that creates insecurity and uncertainty, particularly amongst older members, and could actually be seen as unnecessary fear-mongering in many instances, because the vast majority of tenancies in the private rented sector work well. And I say that the average length of tenancy continues to grow. It's now well over 4 years, according to the English Housing Survey. So I think we have to be careful about the language we use. Most landlords want to know if there's a problem in their property. Most landlords will respond to that positively. But if tenants are being constantly scared from reporting things by being told their tenancy is insecure, and if they report a problem, they could face eviction, that's not helping tenants improve their property. It's not helping tenants build a healthy dialogue and relationship with their landlord. So I think we do have to look at the language we use and how we approach issues like that. But come back to some of the issues about stock. Funding is absolutely key to improving stock in the private rented sector, for what various governments will undoubtedly think good reason hasn't seen the level of investment that social housing has to bring it up to either a decent standard or to tackle energy efficiency. You know, there is a definite reluctance from governments to be seen to be bunging private landlords cash. But if we want to improve that stock, and particularly around about energy efficiency, if we want to take that stock from an E up to a C or a B or an A, there is going to have to be support. When there was support available through various schemes, for energy efficiency, there was great take up, and I think that has helped improve. I think we've shown that where a carrot is offered along with a stick, that the landlords will respond and make the necessary improvements. And I think we're going to have to relearn that lesson if the government's going to meet its ambitious targets. I think the other issue is around about adaptations. In our survey, around a fifth of our members had made adaptations. Half of those landlords had actually funded those adaptations themselves. So they hadn't gone through the Disabled Facilities Grant or any of the routes there. They're funding those investments themselves. So, you know, there is a willingness from landlords, but what there isn't, there's a lack of requests from tenants, and I think there's a lack of awareness of the funding that's available. So more can definitely be done to improve the private rented sector, and we want to work with a range of bodies to deliver that. And we do recognise that there is an issue coming down the road. Cost is a huge issue, and my final note would be housing benefit is probably the single biggest investment that the government makes in housing, and we are not using it well. We are spending housing benefit in properties that are unfit on quite often criminal landlords, and that needs to stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, John. So I think, you know, some agreement on the underlying data on the solutions, but we'll see when we come to the discussion. So I think I'm pleased to say that we're hopefully going to be able to return to Lord Best, who I think has rejoined us by phone. So Richard, if you can hear me.
I can certainly hear you, Anna.
Great.
Can you hear me?
We can.
You can. Great. So I'm on the phone. Let me respond a bit to John. because that's the advantage of going late. And you've covered a good deal on poor condition, and even said a bit about adaptations, and I'll take those points as read. But I'm afraid the affordability issue is really big. It's really big. This is the killer blow, I'm afraid, for the suitability of the PRS for people over pension age. These are the numbers that we think there will be another 1.5 million private renters who are over pension age. And of that extra, there's 450,000 now, so there's a million and a bit extra. We think that 630,000 of those will have to move because they will not be able to afford the rents. Putting it simply, we know from the Affordable Housing Commission, I recommend their excellent report, that people are spending in the private rented sector more than a third, I'm afraid sometimes more than 40%, and in a few cases more than 50% of their earnings on their rent. Now this means that if you retire and don't have employment in retirement, and for a lot of people that is going to be the situation, they will be on their occupational and state pensions. Those people will have an income that is roughly half. Sorry, those of you working, this is the facts. Incomes will halve, but the rent won't halve. And if you're spending 35, 40% of your income before, and your income halves, then that's 80% of your income going on rent. And don't think that housing benefit can pick up all these cases and pay all the rent. You're probably under-occupying the property, but the market rent will be different from the rent that you receive in housing benefit. And government would not be very happy to see this massive increase in housing benefit. So you'll be on the move, but the danger is there is nowhere to go. What we ought to be doing is producing the affordable housing, that's social housing from councils, from housing associations. We ought to see this window of opportunity while generation rent is still in their late 30s and 40s. We ought to be getting ready for that big boom in renting, because we've reduced the number of homeowners, we've priced them out, and we're going to need affordable housing for people over pension age, people who retire. These are the facts. And at the moment, the housing associations are doing very little. And they, of course, used to do the sheltered housing of yesteryear. A good deal of that now needs upgrading in different ways. But they are not producing anything like the numbers of homes that is going to head off this affordability crisis for older people in the years to come. And that is alongside, I do worry about security of tenure. I do worry about poor condition. I do worry about the difficulty of getting adaptations done. These are multiple other issues as well. The PRS, great stuff for the young, mobile, professional, on the move, not good for people on.
Sorry, we had a rather abrupt end to Richard there. I think we lost him. So I don't know if we might be going to get him back. But I think he made his case very strongly. I think acknowledging points that have been raised by the previous panelists around condition and quality, around insecurity of tenure, and issues around adaptation, but really putting a very strong emphasis that people are just in a very different situation when it comes to affordability. And I think this would be an area perhaps where we can come back to, you know, what can be done about this, because I think that in terms of both current policy and law, there are some things in place around condition, and there are some things in place and funding around accessibility. I'm interested in views on whether they are sufficient, adequate, working. So I think we can touch on that in the discussion. But on this issue of affordability, you know, both in terms of the public purse, in terms of a housing benefit, but also in terms of, I think this comes to the sort of point really, John, that you were raising. You were sort of saying, actually, you know, insecurities, it's talked up too much. But I think that one of the reasons we see people feeling insecure is because at that transition point from work to stopping work, we know that people's incomes, as Lord Best said, drop. And so it's at that transition point that actually the ability to not go into arrears, to continue to pay rent, and at that point then, you know, landlords effectively exercising their rights for older renters. So should we take that sort of as the issue and just get perhaps firstly Sue just to give a reaction about what could we do differently to both perhaps make better use of housing benefit, to try and provide some greater security for people as they make that transition from working to being reliant perhaps on a much lower income. So Sue, do you want to comment on that?
Okay, well, this is a really big one, because we tend to act like there's sort of this natural evolution of tenure change, but actually this tenure change becomes because of social, economic and political decision making. I've lived through a complete tenure revolution. If you take the long view on these things, which I like to do, we've gone from about 1900, it was around 90% private rented. And then by 1970, when we got the really big next change, around half and half of the population was mostly social renting, small private rented sector, half home ownership. And then there was a massive ideological shift and economic shift through the Thatcher years, where there was a political decision to support a move into home ownership. And there were fiscal changes that supported that. It's not just all about right to buy. People tend to think it is. It was a factor, but access to borrowing. And one of the many factors that then changed the move back to private rental has been a combination of not building enough social rented and access to finance. And as John said, poverty, insecure incomes, a gig economy where people have limited access to borrowing. And so you've got to actually, if you've got a vision for the future, which says we want people to have good, secure, affordable housing, you've got to take on board all of those factors: the lifelong income, choice and control, the availability of housing. So that's rather a long answer to a complex question. I just want to pick up one thing about the talking up insecurity. Actually, it's not talking up insecurity. This is evidence-based. If you read the Cachet International Review of Evidence, it is the thing that people mention. And I acknowledge that people don't have their tenures ended for no good reason, but we're heading for a cliff edge. If you take on board Shelter's concerns, we're heading for mass unemployment and all these people in the private rented sector who aren't going to be able to afford their rents. And it's not that landlords are baddies. They need those rents because for a lot of people, that's their income, or that's how they're paying the mortgage or the borrowing on that. So it's not like paint them as baddies. It's a fiscal reality that if you're encouraged under, again, political decision, Gordon Brown encouraging the growth of the single property, the couple of property landlords, and that being underpinning people's later life incomes. These things are all meshed together. So how do we take that forward? Well, what's the vision? And where do you invest capital to reduce revenue costs later on? And I suppose I would certainly support the campaign to build social rented housing, because we're not going to see the revolution which gives everybody access to home ownership. But I do think we also have to look at how our welfare system supports low income home ownership as well. And we have to look at our borrowing systems and our support systems for people in home ownership when their incomes, if they have periods of unemployment, because we've taken away a raft of the support for that. And I think that we also have to think realistically, the PRS's role as a niche that's useful for people at particular points in time. But I would seriously question, which John might take me up on this one, as to whether for many people that should be that's the best lifetime option.
Okay, John, do you want a chance to come back?
I mean, I don't disagree with either Sue or Richard, actually, in the terms of the need for more social or affordable housing. And I think, again, we have to acknowledge the distinction there between affordable and social housing, because we, 80% affordable rents in some parts of the country are simply not affordable for an awful lot of folk. And the social housing sector itself isn't, has a level of culpability here for whatever reason. We've seen a move to market rental properties from social housing. We've seen a move to affordable housing and away from social rents in a lot of cases. But I think it was one of the points I did want to make, that transition is the key point from where someone has been working on an income to retirement, where that income drops off, and how that transition does need to be managed. Most people want to stay, if they've been long term in a home, they want to stay in that home. But the reality is, when you have that income drop, that's not always possible. And at the moment, we do not have the level of social housing required at any level for any age group. It requires social housing and affordable housing. The private rented sector is housing an increasing number of people who are vulnerable or benefit dependent, and it's a sector that's not necessarily well set up to support those people in their tenancies, either in terms of affordability or skill set of landlords. So yeah, we don't disagree. We need to see growth in tenure across the board, but we certainly need to manage that transition better. And it pays to think in the long term, and we have warning here of what's coming down the line. So there should be time to respond if the political will is there. But that's not to say that the private rented sector can, in some circumstances, be a good place to age, again, with the right support in place, either for the landlords, for the sector itself, or, as is more likely, probably through institutional investment and build to rent potentially. But as you see with the student and young professional sector, that level of investment that doesn't meet the affordability test, if you like. They are, for want of a better phrase, creaming off the low risk, better off tenants, and they'll do exactly the same with an aging population as well. So you come back to that issue of people on low incomes and unsuitable or unaffordable properties. That needs to be addressed, and the way to address that is through social housing investment.
Can I just check, because you also raised the point that housing benefits being spent on, I think you even said criminal landlords.
Yeah.
So is there anything that can be done to change the way that housing benefit, any conditions that are attached to that could act as a shift?
There's a whole issue around about housing enforcement in the private rented sector. We've seen a slew of legislation, usually badly drafted, poorly implemented, and certainly dreadfully enforced. And you can have all the legislation you like in the world if you're not enforcing it. And it is absolutely infuriating to many of our members and other landlords to see councils shoveling housing benefit money into substandard, poor quality housing because they have no other option, because if they didn't, their homelessness rates would rocket. They would have nowhere to accommodate people. It is in some ways a bit of a national scandal, frankly. We would like to see a situation where if someone is receiving housing benefit, being placed in private rented sector housing, that doesn't happen unless how the housing is signed off as safe, secure, and legal. So it's not overcrowded. It meets property standards and conditions. And if it doesn't, there's a time scale for which it has to, you know, but the grim reality is, unfortunately, with the availability of housing at the moment, that quite often for local authorities move people into that substandard housing or have them homeless.
Okay, I'm going to, I think we've got Richard back. So I'm going to see if Richard's got thoughts on the second of these sort of two questions about the extent to which current policies and laws, particularly those aimed at the private rented sector, are working. So John suggested that they're not. Obviously, local authorities have powers. Tenants have now got new rights to report properties, but we were hearing that often people are fearful of doing that because of worry that they'll, you know, be thrown out by their landlord. So what are your thoughts, Richard, and what did your report find about what changes were needed to either policy or legislation?
Quite. Well, this hopelessly badly drafted legislation is down to people like me. I took the private members bill, the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018 through Parliament. But what happens afterwards is that enforcement doesn't get followed through. So these acts of Parliament pile up, and sadly, councils have got other things to do. We could do with some selective licensing, which John won't really like, but we need to empower local authorities, but then they need to act, and we do need to enforce tough legislation. Can I just make the overarching point about this? I'm really glad to hear John supporting the need for a substantial increase in social housing, that social rented housing, because we have halved the amount of social housing in the UK, down from about 32, 33% to 17% today. And we have doubled the size of the private rented sector. In a very short space of time, we've done that. And this balance has become out of kilter. We need to redress that. We need to invest heavily in the social renting to catch up, make a difference. Anna, would you like me just to say a COVID word or two? Because, or not yet? I haven't got your sound.
Sorry, Richard, I'd muted myself. As we have you, I think it would be a good idea for you just to make a couple more comments in case we lose you again. So yes, please.
I was just going to say on the COVID side, what's this going to do to the private rented sector? There are choices here. There are going to be quite a few owner-occupiers, younger owner-occupiers with big mortgages who will run into difficulty. They'll lose their job, or they won't be able to keep the same level of earnings one way or another, and they'll escape from owner. So that I think it likely that there will be some sales which could be snapped up by the private landlord, and those could become lettings. We could swell the PRS even larger than it is already. All those could be acquired by the social housing landlords, not least the right to buy properties, which are now let by private landlords. 40% of the 2 million properties sold under right to buy are now privately rented. We could be thinking about buying them back if the occupiers are getting into difficulty. So that's an opportunity. Conversely, it could be that we either get a bigger social rented sector or we get a big private rented sector. It's possible that either way, I think it's in the balance. My own preference, surprise, surprise, would be for heavy investment through the social housing landlords to redress that imbalance between the PRS and the social sector. It could be a great opportunity. The very worst thing is that the worst landlords move in to mop up, take the worst property, think they can squeeze more rent out of it than the previous landlord, An honourable landlord has exited the market and a dishonourable landlord has taken their place. That's the very worst, I think, outcome. It's all to play for.
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting to think about the choices and decisions that are made in the short term as we see the impact of the lockdown and the economic downturn on the housing market. So yeah, very interesting. We've got some questions already come in advance, and I'd like to make sure that we have time for questions from our audience. So if it's all right with you, what I'm going to suggest is that we go to another poll, get your views, and then please do post questions in the Q&A section, and we will start to pick those up after the poll. So this is really around the benefits. We heard about the benefits for potentially students and young professionals who perhaps want to be mobile, but what could be the main benefits of private renting when approaching later life? Is it more freedom, greater flexibility, greater housing choice? Can you not see any benefits, or less maintenance? So I think you only can choose one, so please vote away. Okay, if you haven't already made your mind up, please vote. And then we can close the vote and see the results, please. Oh, quite split. Nobody thinks that it gives people a choice. Bit of flexibility. 35% of you not seeing any benefits at all. I think we've talked a lot about some of the problems, so that's perhaps not surprising. But recognising that for some, less maintenance is something that would be an advantage with those responsibilities falling to the landlord. And indeed, obviously, one of the potential benefits of some of the retirement communities, which have a sort of hybrid model, sometimes of ownership and lease. In effect, you know, there is a maintenance and is held by the landlord. But obviously, for some people who want to just live in more mixed age communities, perhaps that they might want some of those options. I guess the other is moving closer to family, but without actually selling your primary property and buying a new one. I guess there might be some different choices there, but I guess at the moment we're not really, there isn't really the sort of diversity of choices. So perhaps we can come to the panel and close the poll. I don't know if we can take that down. Thank you. And maybe as you're sort of looking and thinking about questions you'd like to post up for the panel, I could come to one that's been submitted by somebody called Tony Zeilinger. And thinking about some of the pension funds, obviously sitting on large amounts of capital, should they be investing in sort of different types of housing, particularly to meet the needs of potentially low to moderate earners who are in private rented as they approach later life? So what might that look like, a sort of build to rent for older renters? And is that something that institutional investors should be looking to? So who might have a view on that? Sue, do you want to come in first?
I think probably other parties are better on this one, but I just would flag up on the build to rent. If we go back to Richard's numbers and his point about this, I think he said 630,000 not going to be able to afford to rent. Well, if you're going to build to rent, you want a good return. So you're going to want to go for the other half who can afford it.
Okay.
So I don't see that that's really helping the wider social picture of what are you going to do about the people who can't afford it. You're just always, it makes economic sense, doesn't it, to go for the best off. I mean, I think at a micro level, there are a very small number of people who I think there's I won't mention the company, but there has been a retirement housing to rent sector which has enabled people in London, and we haven't talked about London and the South East versus the rest of the country so far, but who've got very high equity properties, to move to the coast, get the money from their housing and have a nice lifestyle and pay rent. And so again, you've got a niche product for the better off.
Okay.
That just doesn't get us any closer to tackling the large scale issue that's coming our way of people who can't afford this if we carry on with this rate of growth across the life course. And so I think, yeah, niches, but always be realistic. That private sector needs to, pension funds, we won't get our pensions unless they get return on their investment. So you're going to go to the end of the market where you can make some money. And we just have to, I think, rely on, we can't just rely on that private sector to help these very large numbers who are going to be on the streets, in the hospitals, or worse.
John, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree actually that there ought to be more investment generally in housing from private pension providers. My husband used to chair a local government pension fund when we were councillors up in Aberdeen, and there just seemed to be an incredible reluctance to invest in housing generally from pension providers. Retail always preferred, of course, they need a spread of investment, but I do wonder with what we're seeing in the commercial rental sector at the moment, office space and retail space, whether perhaps that will give a bit of impetus to pension funds to look at investing in housing to rent across the board, not just for older people. And of course, that is going to be new housing. It's going to come with a certain standard, and of course at that point you begin to look at all age housing, so how, you know, housing that people can age through life in. But I take the point that Sue says, there will be an investment requirement. You know, compared to commercial, residential doesn't necessarily give the sort of returns that funds are looking for, but if we're going to see a growth in people needing to rent, then it is a safe, secure and long-term return, which could balance the need for yield. So while it's maybe not meeting the housing need for the most vulnerable or a particular level, it will create new housing. It will ease pressure elsewhere in the market. And of course, you could attach an element of affordable housing to that through planning or whatever. So I don't think it should be dismissed, but it's certainly not a silver bullet.
Richard, I think you're with us still, although we can't see you. Hopefully you can hear us and we can hear you. So do you want to come in on the end of that at all with any view about?
Sure. I think that COVID's going to make a difference. Office investment by these pension funds into property in the future will not mean into offices. There is in fact 15 million square foot of offices under construction as we speak in London. A lot of it's going to stay empty. So the property guys in the pension fund will turn their backs on offices. Retail, we've got used to shopping online, haven't we? Quite quickly. It all comes in those Amazon boxes. I'm afraid the high street is in trouble. Retail does not sound like a good place if you want to put money into property. That just leaves residential. And in effect, I think we're going to be seeing the legal and generals of this world really focusing attention on how they can best invest. But as Sue said, as John has said in effect, this is the upmarket end. The owner-occupiers who sell for $1 million and don't have any children, what the hell? Spend the money. Get someone else to do the maintenance. Absolutely. You can burn the capital, but this is not the mass market, and it's not the 630,000 who can't afford market rents. So.
Can I then just, while I've got you, put another question that's come in from Suzanne Noble, who's founder of something called Silver Sharers. I don't know if that may be about sharing property. So it's to your point about affordability, really, Richard, that rental accommodation, you know, is proving to be unaffordable for many people over 50. And what solutions to that affordability question would you be proposing?
The big one is that we want lots more socially provided housing. That isn't just for rent, because some people will be homeowners and have some capital to put in. That's shared ownership as well. But we need to get building for this. Building is what's going to revive the economy. It always does when we come out of recessions. We build our way out. It's labor intensive. It spreads the money around the country. We want to get building. We want to be preparing ourselves for the much larger number of people who are going to need to rent, and indeed, as I say, shared ownership as well. Yeah, let's have a mix of tenure. Big opportunities there. It's I'm afraid it sounds expensive, but as Sue said earlier, in fact, investing in the bricks and mortar now and saving on your housing benefit for the next 50 years turns out to be not a bad bet. Treasury hate it because it's money up front. They never have the money when you want it. But this is serious investment. Who has regretted investing in property over the last 100 years?
Great. So if people are happy, I'll move on to take some of the questions we've received online. So one of them was specifically for you, John, but I'm sure perhaps Sue might have views as well. Around tenants not asking for adaptations for fear of losing their lease. Is there evidence of this? What do we know about the sort of willingness of landlords to adapt homes as people's needs change?
Well, it's something I alluded to, Anna, in my initial statement, and that there is a willingness, at least from our members, to consider and carry out adaptations, and actually half of the ones who have done it at their own cost, not even accessing the grant support and the like that's available. So, I think that the landlords generally, where they've got a tenant in situ who is looking after the property and paying rent, they are happy to look at adaptations. They're happy, particularly if there's financial support available through the disabled facilities grants and the like, to make those adaptations. But as I say, half of landlords are just paying for those adaptations because they want to retain the tenants. So it's where I come back to. I think there's been so much talk about insecurity and the fact that, don't ask for repairs. If you ask for repairs, you risk getting evicted. I don't think it's a helpful way to approach things, because the evidence actually isn't there. There's only 10% of tenancies are ended by the landlord for whatever reason. It is almost always for rent arrears or antisocial behaviour, not for other reasons. So while we have this narrative of insecurity in the sector and the putting a fear of people into approaching perfectly reasonable landlords for improvements, then that's an issue, because people are then not getting the repairs, the maintenance, the adaptations that they need, when actually an approach to the landlord will probably be met positively. We've actually seen it in the COVID crisis. Depending on the surveys used, 75% of landlords or 90% of landlords responding positively to requests from tenants for support during the crisis with rent. But only 18% of tenants have asked for that support.
Okay, so let's find out from Sue. How do you see it? Tenants not asking, says John.
I think it's a completely mixed bag. Again, we have to come back to this is a diverse market with a very different approach amongst different landlords. And we also know that there's a strong correlation between disadvantaged, poor health and disability. And so you are going to get the higher level of a need for an adaptation and modification, ironically, amongst the poorest and the worst off, and probably in the worst houses. There is evidence about insecurity across the board, and people's views on that. It is there. And people aren't just talking it up and making it up. So I think we have to come back to the data. Very few disabled facilities grants are given to people in private rented housing, and that's not they're not being refused, they're not being asked. What the one big trend is, there's a huge rise in the level of applications for disabled facilities grants from social tenants. They're hoovering up sort of 70% of the money now, and that's disproportionate. And so across, it's not working well across tenures. It's fantastic where it helps, but it's certainly not reaching the PRS in particular. And so we're very reliant on anecdotal evidence as well about, and we hear the bad side and the complaints. People are not going to contact local agencies because it's all been great. And so you pick up on the ones where it doesn't work. Problems of the growing PRS, the bad end, if you like, where there've been permitted developments, and I think this is very relevant to that earlier point about we're going to be awash with unwanted commercial property and unwanted out of town properties that for offices, they're not going to be needed anymore. And we've seen this big rush to, especially London South East city centres, to use permitted development, and created the most appalling new homes. And that's where adapting those is completely impossible. They're very poor standard. And I have this huge worry about post-COVID collapse of centres, and retail empty, offices empty, and a rush to convert that into very poor quality PRS, even if it's just to get perhaps the people who are homeless out of travel lodge. You know, so I think that that's a risk that we have to be very aware of, and that won't be adaptable at all, and it won't be good quality housing for health for anybody at any age.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's a question here which may be a bit long and technical. I'll try and pose it in a simple way. So trying to think about people planning ahead, thinking about the fact that their income might drop when they stop work, whether there is any sort of protection policy so that, you know, could be developed. So what's the role really for financial services to develop any product that could really help people, I suppose, protect money for rental and some of those everyday essentials. So is that something that's, you know, at all useful or feasible? And similarly, you know, I think are there any other links between products around sort of equity release or the ability for people to take perhaps smaller chunks of their wealth and put that into some of the affordable shared ownership options that might also provide them with a bit more security, even if they are not in a position to be mortgage free? So just something really around what are the different financial products? Do we need to see new and innovative financial products and services that could help with some of the issues that we've been discussing for private renters? I don't know if that's something, Richard, that you have looked at or have any views about the role of financial products. We may have lost Richard.
Can you put me on, please?
Yes, got you.
Yep. Here I am,
yep.
Back again. I think you're clutching at straws to think that there might be financial products that would help for people who can't afford the rent. But basically, that end of the spectrum, that's not going to work. But financial products for people who are homeowners but don't have very much equity, don't own a very expensive property. This, I think, is a huge opportunity to get some of that, those 5,000, 10,000 upgrade. And my great golden hope has been that Nationwide Building Society is offering, I believe it's now starting as a pilot in various places, equity release products that are very there's a big potential movement of money, but it's to the poorer homeowners rather than to the tenants of the future, I fear, Anna.
Yep, okay. Does anybody else want to come in, or are you going to agree violently with Richard?
Yeah, broadly agree. I think you know, we're asking already hard up tenants to pay even more of their income out to protect their tenancy at some future date. I just can't see it working.
So, I mean, in some ways, I think our conversation is almost moving towards a sense in which really we can't see a future where, for many people, it certainly at lower incomes, being in private rented accommodation is where you want to be when you get to post-working age, let's say, whatever that is. I mean, that's what I'm sort of hearing, and that actually, if in that situation the state is spending large amounts of money through housing benefit to subsidise, you know, and make the housing affordable to them, that actually, wouldn't we be better spending that money in social housing, where people will both have more affordable rents and hopefully better quality, because on the whole, the quality of those properties, the accessibility of them, and certainly the condition is a lot better than the PRS, and that they will have, you know, much greater degree of security. So if that's what I'm hearing you almost, I'm summing up a bit that I hear you concluding, then all these other ideas we keep generating are actually are sort of not relevant, because the sort of underlying conclusion I hear is, if at all possible, we should get all these people out of private rented before they hit retirement, or at the point they hit retirement, if they are low income. Is that what I'm hearing you say? So I suppose I'm putting that down, and please disagree and tell me that there are some solutions other than that.
I think you need to be careful not to generalise the Iran, because there are, because as Sue's pointed out, the private rented sector is not homogenous, and there are some parts of the country where private renting is affordable. Rents are not substantially more in some instances than social housing and the like. So I think, and the other thing is, what do you do in the short term? Because there is a need now for affordable housing for vulnerable people, older people, and we're not meeting that need now. So at the very least, in the medium term, you're going to have to find a private rented sector solution. So while the long-term solution might be to manage that transition from private renting to social housing for a substantial number of people, there is still a need to look at solutions for the now, the short and the medium term, and also acknowledge actually that in some parts of the country, the issues that seem to typify the private rented sector actually don't apply there, because rents are more affordable, and you know, with support, properties can be perfectly good homes for people in the longer term as they grow older.
Sue?
I think this issue of the short, medium and long-term approach is key. And also we've touched a little bit on geographical differences, and possibly where we diversify with divergent opinion here is if we talk about areas, the poorer places in this country, which will tend to have older and poorer housing, where you might say the rents are more affordable, the quality of that stock can be exceedingly poor. And there's a strong correlation between the incidence of the lack of social housing, the incidence of poor PRS and poor health. So if I think of a place like Blackpool, you've got, it's not cost effective for a private landlord to invest in those properties where they're not going to get a return on what it costs to make those properties better places to live. And so we do still come back to that mismatch between the value of the property, the income generated, and making it a good place to live. And I suppose contentiously, I would argue that with some of those, it would be better, your money's better spent building new social housing of good quality, as opposed to using social housing money to buy up some of those properties and spend a lot of money doing them up. And the quality issue, I think, is really key.
Yeah. And so what about the short term, though, accepting that that's your long term sort of vision and investment in new social housing? I think Richard was also suggesting that was his preferred sort of long term. The fact is, there are private renters today living in some, you know, not so good circumstances. What more can be done today to help them? I was going to carry on with you, Sue, if you wanted to carry on.
Yeah.
And then I'll go to the others.
Okay. Oh, here and now. Well, I think the here and now, older people who are today living in substandard housing in all the different tenures. This is could be part of job creation for the future, and the whole green agenda. We're going to have some public investment in bringing the quality of that stock up, even if it's a case of then putting charges on properties for the longer term. That won't always be very popular in the private rented sector. But if there isn't the cash up front, and we've got to do something about that housing in the context of a population which is in poor health, I think we have to have some capital investment in the short term to decarbonise, to retrofit. We've lost all the investment that we had between the war till 2010 in tackling disrepair in our existing housing stock. And I know we all want to build new, but that's not going to happen overnight. So we do need to bring back some capital investment in the existing housing stock to tackle poor housing across all tenures.
So Richard, I don't know how much you've caught of the last round of conversation, but I think there's been quite a lot of agreement about some of the longer term solutions, but we're just coming really to any immediate short term policies or investments.
Sure. I mean, I think, Anna, the switch from housing benefit to capital grants is so sensible, but you have to have both in the interim. Sadly, we can't stop paying housing benefit at the current levels. Indeed, I'd go with John and say local housing allowances need to be higher. So we've got to pay more, even on the revenue side, to start with. It just comes right, though, investing in capital programs, producing stuff that you can let at affordable rents. That will follow. I think that Sue is right. How to persuade Treasury that this is a target for really substantial investment when we've got by without spending the money so far. There hasn't been a revolution amongst older people in substandard properties. I think it's the green agenda coming to play here. The opportunities for work, for job creation. You can work your way down the street doing an incredible amount of work, employing an awful lot of people, and you're heading for zero carbon at a much faster rate if you're investing sensibly in the green agenda. So I think that's the one that squares the circle. And by making a home better insulated, better heated, lowering those fuel bills, cutting fuel poverty, you are actually also fixing the roof and doing other things because they're a necessary part of that greening of properties. So I think that's the chance to get at Treasury at a time when it's awkward to say we want more housing benefit at the same time as we want lots more capital grant to make social renting a reality.
Great. And there was a question, and I'll pose it to you very quickly now, just for a short answer. Are there any other countries doing this well that we could learn from?
Sadly, nearly everybody's doing better than us. No, it's international studies I always find incredibly depressing, as we always seem to come out so badly. But yeah, no, I think Holland is pretty close, isn't it? Most of us have been to Holland a few times and seen good things going on, a mix of tenure, loads of social housing, loads of good quality private renting, mix it all up together, have mixed tenure developments side by side along the waterfront in Amsterdam or wherever. They use planning much more powerfully than we do. We haven't talked about planning. When it comes to new build, there is always that trade-off with the developer. We want, for the local community, we want this much affordable housing. We want these standards, lifetime home standards. This is what we as planners want. And being tough with those negotiations, getting what we want out of new build, that's down to planners. And those planning departments are not strong enough. Developers, the big house builders, can run circles around them. Viability is trotted out over and again. Oh, we can't possibly do all that affordable housing. We want councils to be resolute, to stand firm, not to allow development that doesn't satisfy proper standards and doesn't include enough affordable housing. Be tough. In the end, the developer then has to negotiate a lower price for the land. Inconvenient, but that's an easy price to pay, really. Pay less for the land, get better quality, get more affordable housing.
Okay, so it sounds like we should be trying to do a bit more Dutch, but it sounds like there's other countries
Yes,
we can
Dutch.
as well. So I might just very briefly, because we're about to sort of come to the end. But John, you actually in your opening remarks did make the points about the carbon neutral agenda, but also that some homes were hard to adapt. So, I mean, Sue's proposal there for and Richard for some capital investment.
Yeah, I think actually, sorry.
Or do we need to get rid of some of the old stock?
There's two issues. Well, they're all related, actually. I think the first thing you have to understand, there's very good research that shows that refurbishing a property is always better in terms of carbon than demolishing and building new. So I think we have to think very carefully about some of the worst stock. Is it really the right thing to environmentally to demolish that in terms of we're looking for carbon neutral? I think grants need to be a lot more tenure neutral. There's a whole pile of things have been removed from the private rented sector. One of the simple barriers is the tax system. The fact that environmental measures are seen as improvements and landlords can't reclaim the VAT and the tax, or set it against tax until the property is sold. It's set off against capital gains rather than against income tax and expenditure at the time. So that's a very simple change that would encourage landlords to invest up front, would be to allow them to offset improvement costs at the time of spend. The landlord's energy saving allowance was scrapped 5 years ago, just before the minimum energy standards were brought in, which are short-sighted and retrograde steps. I think there needs to be a combination of incentivization through the tax system, hard grant, because we know that works. There's evidence that works. The grant funding needs to be tenure neutral. But there is a real issue, I think Sue touched on it, in low value homes, to bring some of those homes up to a really good energy efficiency standards of C or B. You're talking a 60 or 70,000 pound home with a 30 or 40 or 50,000 pound spend against it, and that's not practical for any investor. So I think we have to consider what we're going to do with those sort of homes. I think there is a place, and there will be, because of increasing regulation and tax changes and things, and there are going to be landlords who are looking to exit, and I think we have to find a way of managing that exit for those landlords, and finding a way of using those properties and ensuring those properties are up to standard. Richard's right, we don't want to see those simply transferring within the private rental sector to the very worst landlords. So when those properties come in the market, we need to find a way of incentivizing the purchaser, whoever that might be, to bring them up to a much higher standard. As I say, there is an issue of refurbishment versus new build. The energy sprung system and retrofit has a huge role to play. It can help boost economic recovery post-COVID. I think all of these things are really important. And the other thing, to go back to the investment issue, again, there are landlords looking to exit that sector. And if we want to see investment in new properties, new building quality properties, is there a vehicle the government could create so that when landlords disinvest from property, they could reinvest in property in a different way, through some of these institutional vehicles, perhaps?
Okay. So thank you to all of you, the panelists, to Richard, John and Sue. It's been a very rich discussion, and I'm afraid we haven't managed to get to all the questions. There's a few just come in at the last minute, but perhaps our panelists can have a look at those, and if they are able to and have time and interest, maybe they could reply to some of those questions just online in the Q&A. So sorry that we didn't get to all of those. I think you'll agree it's been a fascinating and extremely rich conversation. I think we see that there is a big issue in terms of generation rent and their future. We also know, however, there are people today, older private renters, who are perhaps some of the poorest, living in some of the worst conditions. And it's really critical that in the short term, action is taken to address that. I think we've all got a vision that we want more diverse housing across tenures that's both affordable, accessible, energy efficient, and that's going to require investment. And I think we've heard ideas about both private investment and public investment that's going to be needed to realise that. And also, I think we've heard the sort of consequences if we don't, that there'll be very serious health consequences. The housing benefit bill will balloon, and obviously there will be really negative impacts for those people themselves, if they are living with the sort of worries of not being able to afford their housing in later life, or potentially living in a house that isn't suitable for their changing needs. So a real sense that we must do something about it, both in the short term, but also in the medium to long term. So I'm really grateful for all the thoughts that have been shared. I think it just leaves me to say that obviously there are other ILC UK webinars going on, so please stay up to date and check that out on their website, or you can follow them on Twitter. The @ILC UK is there, or on Facebook. And we've been delighted at the Centre for Ageing Better as a partner of ILC UK to partner on this event. Safe and accessible housing is one of our priority goals, along with connected communities, keeping people in fulfilling work and helping people to age healthily. So please also do check out our work in this area on housing and get involved. And for those of you who are interested, there is a chapter on housing, as I mentioned at the beginning, in my new book on the age of aging better. So if people are interested in more about the changes that we need to create a better future, which I know ILC and Centre for Ageing Better, we both share that ambition, please do check that out. So I think without further ado, I'm not sure I'm passing to Donna, am I, for any final remarks, or otherwise just thanking everyone for joining. Thanks very much.
On mute.
So I'm hoping that we've
Sorry.
live. Are we done?
Hi.
Thanks to everyone.
I think there's a delay. Hearing me now. Right. Yes. So just to say thank you so much to all our speakers today, particularly all of you, and certainly Dr. Anna Dixon and Centre for Ageing Better, one of our partners, and thanks to our partners for making this webinar. What we do. And you can see if you can't, great. You can see me?
I don't know. Sorry, Donna. We didn't hear you, but I think we're all done here. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining. Goodbye.
And excellent. Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.